as a filmmaker, when you are, waking up before dawn and working through the night in this world, in this story day after day, what's your headspace like? How do you get through the day without just being crushed by the sort of tragedy of this story?
Well, it's funny. At a certain point in your career, you try to acquire a certain amount of, I guess I'd call it a passionate detachment, which is to say you work no less hard, but you can't eat your liver every day because you just wouldn't be able to do it. And this goes for comedies as well as something like this, because you're always confronting your limitations and what you feel you failed at and what is not reached that vision that you might have had. And if you let that just destroy you, it's harder and harder to get up each day. The hard part really for me was spending the time inside, meeting people on the road, talking to the guards, talking to people who knew Todd, people spending time with Elizabeth, people whose lives this really reflected. Because for those of us who make these movies, we are essentially voyeurs. We dip into this life and presume to talk about them and present them, but in fact, we can escape. And so you feel a real obligation to honor what had happened and what the truth is of this. And that costs. And I don't know, how many people here have been inside a maximum security prison, but you're confronted immediately with something that you hadn't expected, which is to say you're walking down this row and you don't know whether or not to actually engage visually with someone who is there, because you're objectifying them and you're looking in on them. On the other hand, if you don't, then you're not recognizing their humanity. And immediately you're confronted with this dilemma. And that gets multiplied again and again.
You've made a lot of films dealing with social issues and historical issues, some of which, like Glory and Defiance, are historical pieces. But then films like Blood Diamond or Love and Other Drugs that are about things that are still unfolding and people who are still alive. Does that change the process at all? Is there one that you prefer, or are they all different in their own way?
There's something ineffable that happens when you just either think of something to write or read something you want to adapt, and you've had this experience, and what you realize is you're going to have to go through this whole process of a year or 2 years, or in this case 9 years, of deconstructing it, breaking it down to all its discrete pieces in the hope that you'll get back to that feeling that you had that when the hairs raised on your arms when you read it for the first time. And when it's about something that is pro-social or in some, or even historical, you have a very particular relationship to it, because for better or for worse, movies have become the permanent record, more than the books should be, or even documentaries. And so I think you feel even a greater sense of responsibility to them.
Interesting. Let's talk a little about the casting here. First of all, Jack O'Connell. I'm constantly surprised, to find out who on television isn't American.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if he were sitting here now and he would be speaking, he's from Derby, which is a kind of combination of English and Irish, and it's almost unintelligible, in fact. But he
unlike Texas accents.
Yeah, and that thing that he gets there is pretty darn close to Corsicana. I mean, he worked with a man named Tim Monick, who is one of the great dialect coaches of all time. I worked with Leonardo DiCaprio with Tim on Blood Diamond, but he really was one of the creators of that as an art at Juilliard, and so. Obviously, Jack worked really hard. I was lucky enough that he had done some work. I went to see him with Sienna Miller. He had done Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, which was actually a different accent. Nonetheless, it was certainly already in that vernacular.
And did he have much audio of Todd to work from? Like, were there trial tapes or anything?
Very, very little. No. In fact, it was about what Tim's process is very interesting. He goes and tries to find real people And it's not just about the accent, it's about the attitude. Which of those people seems to evoke that character as much as just the sound?
And then, Laura Dern, of course, is
A goddess.
a goddess. Was she easy to land here? Was there, was it different?
We'd known each other. We had friends in common. We never worked together. It was as simple as it should be, which is to say, I sent her the script. We sat down. She said yes, and thus began, a process. And the process was, it was terrific, and also terrifically intense, because she spent a lot of time getting to know Elizabeth, reading the letters, trying to understand who that person was. But then again, she had things of her own life that she could relate to. Laura is now a single mother of 2 teenagers. She has been involved in activist causes that have been successful and unsuccessful. So she had a point of reference, and she also, as she says, she was raised by 2 nutty actors, and has been married to a couple others, and has a particularly really lovely way of working with someone like Jack, who's very volatile and hugely talented, but much less experienced than she is, and that was very helpful to me, I have to admit.
Was there rehearsal time
None.
as part? None.
No, we had no rehearsal, and I, in fact, we talked about it, but I did not want them to work together at all until those scenes that we shot chronologically when they meet. I wanted there to be discovery in that, and they did their. I worked with them separately, and we did some of the other pieces of the film, obviously, but that was saved and done almost as a kind of two-hander. We did them in sequence, and I felt there would be discovery to be found.
Absolutely. And speaking of activist causes, clearly a film like this, there's an intent to get certain people to see it, to bring it into the zeitgeist in a certain way. What are your plans up to, including and beyond, the film's distribution, as far as trying to make those conversations happen?
Well, a movie like this is a difficult commercial bet. It's Friday night, and let's get a babysitter and go watch that Death Row movie. But you hope that you cross over into the op-ed, into editorial spaces. Ironically, the net is a place where something like this might be able to do that, as opposed to TV ads and billboards. Right. We don't know. You do something like this without the expectation that it alone will change anything. I've been involved in too many things to have those expectations, but I do believe that you're adding your voice to what becomes a rising chorus, and that in time there are paradigm shifts, and there's going to be a paradigm shift about the death penalty. It's inevitable and feels more imminent all the time, and you just do what you can do. That was my feeling when I read this. When I read the article for the first time, what I can do, I can make a movie. And and Elizabeth's example is remarkable. That one loving, an act of loving kindness can yield this extraordinary relationship. So,
I think over the course of your career, you've been drawn to this kind of material and interested in sharing these kinds of stories. And I'm wondering, where does that come from in terms of your own background or filmmakers who've influenced you?
I guess there's something presumptuous about wanting to have, a seat at the table or a part of the conversation. Or I was a journalist when I first began, and once you've done that, you're forever that in some way. But I don't think I was a particularly good journalist. I think that I might have actually had a chance to be a better filmmaker, and so that's part of it. I also think that the theater of ideas is a very interesting context for personal stories, and I'd like to think that I'm as interested in the personal stories as I am in the writ large headlines or the capital letters. And I think a lot of movies that are very good movies have been done in or good important subjects have been done in by sort of what's that? Sort of very
Grandstanding?
yeah, and sort of very obvious colorations of good and bad.
Sure.
And it was very important for me, and I think what maybe drew me to this is the fact that the character of Todd Willingham was also in some way disreputable. That it wasn't an obvious sentimental choice to
Right.
look at the subject. It might give it some more texture and more layering and maybe more authenticity.
Yeah, he is in no way this sort of like wholly innocent and or sort of sainted character. He does have
Right.
flaws. He has committed actions that are deplorable, but that doesn't necessarily that obviously doesn't mean that he's not entitled to
And I thought that strengthened the case
absolutely.
in some way.
We have time for some questions. The hand went right up and back. Yes.
Didn't the district attorney get sued and ultimately disbarred for his failure to disclose?
He was indeed sued. He was given a choice as to whether or not he wanted to be tried before a jury of his peers, which is to say by the bar review. He had the option, it's a very odd and arcane clause, to be able to actually retry the case, which he did in front of a jury in Corsicana, Texas, and he was, in fact, exonerated by them again, because he did this. He tried the exact same case before the same people and had the same result.
Yes.
You used the scenes between Punch and Todd to provide a tremendous amount of information about the judicial system, the political times of the day, prisoners' rights, etc., all in just those particular scenes that were incredible. My question is, why was that important to you to provide so much information about what was going on, and why did you choose those particular scenes and those characters?
Well, first of all, I worried a little bit because there was so much information there, and you really worried that, in fact, you're going to be standing on a soapbox. And that's the one scene that scared me, in fact, for that reason. Obviously, what's anomalous about this case is it's happening to a white man. But what you learn, the more you study it, it's even as much as it's about race, it's about class, and it's about poverty. And I felt that this, by the way, there was a character like this, and he did write about a person like this, so I had the basis of that relationship in his letters to go by. And I felt that, we had to invest in someone else to see that process. It's the only scene that actually gives me a little bit of pause because it does step outside itself to make some very cleverly stated, homilies about what's going on there. I just couldn't resist.
Yes, ma'am.
I want to say a special thank you because I was following this case when it actually was occurring, and I thought you portrayed it really well, and I appreciate your accuracy because not having accuracy really disempowers the story and all the advocates that work for abolition of the death penalty. So I want to thank you. I have two questions. One is, I want to know what Elizabeth Gilbert is doing now and what she says more people need to do to create change. And the second is, what happened with the prison guard who became a human being during the process?
First of all, Elizabeth, she's going to be with us. We're going to D.C. with the movie in front of a lot of legislators and justices and showing the movie there. She was with us in Telluride when we premiered the movie. She's doing better incrementally. She, has limited use of her functions, and what she is doing, she's writing, and I'm hoping that sees the light of day. In terms of the guard, he was really a composite. I met a lot of guards in my time researching the movie. There was one that Todd particularly wrote about. There's one guard, and I can't remember his name, who was in fact one of the guards, not in his chamber, but in the chamber, who has left his job to become an anti-death penalty advocate in oh gosh, it might be Arkansas. I don't know, but I spoke to him at length. It was somehow a composite. I wanted there to be a dramatization of something that someone said to me. A jailer said to me. He said, "You have to understand that we spend our lives in prison too."
Building off your comment, I wanted to ask real quick, what kind of vetting did you do with the script as far as fact checking and that kind of
Well,
thing?
first of all, the Innocence Project was wonderful. And Bereshek and several others from there were available to us all the time. Obviously, we had the transcripts, we had the letters. I brought the movie to Austin last year outside of South by when we were finishing it, and I showed it to Charlie Baird, who was one of the judges who tried to create an exoneration that was disallowed, to several other lawyers who'd been on the case. And I really wanted to get as close as I could, inevitably in a movie like this. And you're right to talk about the danger of Bowdlerizing something, because that is to dishonor a thing. On the other hand, you've got to have a story that has within it the shape of drama. And a lot of pieces don't. That's what lead people to then screw with them.
Dismiss it.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's the first representation I've ever seen in a film of that kind of execution, that is by poison. And the general sense that it's conveyed to the public is that prisoners basically fall asleep to death. What sort of research did you do?
The question is about the lethal injection execution, that a lot of people think it's merely like falling to sleep, and we don't see it a lot in movies. What was the research involved?
Well, we did a lot of research, obviously, but I don't know if you've been following the headlines that 2 weeks ago, Judge Kavanaugh released an opinion. I'm sorry, it was Gorsuch's opinion about the Eighth Amendment, about a man who was suffering from a particular ailment that they knew would cause him to have the most horrendous suffocation that would go on for possibly even hours. And they ruled that was allowed under the Eighth Amendment of cruel and unusual punishment. And that same decision that they've made will now allow them to try to give juveniles much more serious sentences, because they're expanding the notion of what cruel and unusual punishment is.
Wasn't there at least one company that makes the lethal injection drugs that was going to stop? producing them?
And Arkansas, when they were running out of them, decided to execute people more quickly. But they're now trying to import drugs from Europe and from China.
Yes.
Hi, I'm a student of Rick Halperin's at SMU Human Rights Program, and I'm really glad I had the opportunity to see this as we're currently studying the death penalty and all the atrociousness associated with it. So thank you very much for doing this, because as far as my studies are concerned, you really brought a lot into a very small period of time, and there was a lot of information there. And I don't want you to worry about it not being a piece people want to sit on a Friday night, because as long as one person sees it and they talk about it, that's going to make a huge difference. My question is before you made this film, were you anti-death penalty, or did you become anti-death penalty as you?
Yes, that's a really good question. I would say I was casually anti-death penalty, in the same way that Elizabeth was a knee-jerk liberal. I think a lot of us have positions and attitudes that we don't necessarily explore, because they're never, put to the test, and we never have to walk the walk. So, yeah, I mean, we could talk about the death penalty, and I think that's probably not the subject of this conversation. But I've thought a lot about it, and had thought a lot about it in terms that I never had before. Going past the morality and the social injustice and the broken system, the latest thought that I've had to do with the power of the state. That when we give the state a certain amount of power, the state just can't help but abuse it. And whether that's about drone strikes, or whether it's about surveillance, or all those various ways. And I just felt that this was particularly a moment in which we are looking at the violation of certain norms in our political civil society right now. And when I look at those guys standing up there at the end, I don't only see Rick Perry. I see a whole thing happening, and so I sort of felt motivated by that as well.
Yes.
Oh, you again?
Yeah. One of the things I noticed about many of your films is that, just like this one in Glory, you have these characters that face these insurmountable odds, these challenges that are not going to probably come out good. But as anti-Hollywood as that could be, in Hollywood they always come out surviving and living and doing great things at the end.
And yet I've got to make more movies.
So can you just talk about that process? Because when these characters don't make it, there's a much larger and greater story that actually comes out than probably if they had made it.
Well, I had the most wonderful professor I ever had in college. He was professor of Shakespearean tragedy. And he said that the reason that tragedy is the eternal form is because it is the most restful. Because we know when Lear gives away his kingdom what's going to happen. We know when Hamlet kills his father. We know this is only going to lead one way. But because we know that, that conforms to what we actually secretly know about life, which is life only goes in that direction. And that oddly, that is comforting because it reaffirms something that we get anxious by comedy. We know when we see fake happy endings, and yeah, we want to believe it, but somewhere deep down we don't. So I think there is something in the more classic shape that way.
Time for one more. Yes.
Sure.
I noticed that you didn't mention in postscript about the shenanigans Rick Perry did with the Texas Forensic Science Commission.
Yeah, I mean, look, I could have written a novel. You know, it's funny. He evoked Glory at the end of the story of Glory. There were men. The first man that carried the flag back was the first black winner of the Congressional Medal of Honor. There are always stories that continue after the stories. You just have to end it at some place. And we were already getting long, and the story was over. But you're right. That's a whole the disbanding of that, and it's horrible.
And when will Trial by Fire be in theaters?
May the 17th, which is really about what 3 weeks? 3 weeks from now.
Tell your friends.
Yeah, tell your friends if you have one.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Best of luck with this.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. It was great.